The prairie town looked quiet under the weight of the afternoon sun, yet Sarah felt every whisper that drifted through its streets. Dust rose with every step she took, clinging to her dress, clinging like the doubts that had never left her. People greeted her with polite nods, but their eyes carried the same pity she had grown used to. Behind shutters and shop counters, they spoke of her in hushed voices. They all knew. They all judged. She had no children, and the silence of her womb had become her shadow. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter across her shoulders. She tried to hold her head high, though her heart carried the heaviness of shame. A woman's worth here on the edge of the frontier was measured by the children she bore, the sons who would carry on a name, work the land, guard the homestead. She had none to give, and though she tried to hide it, the thought that she was not enough gnawed at her, day after day. Daniel, the man she was set to marry, did not seem to see her shame. He was a rancher, tall, strong, weathered by the sun, respected for his independence. Where others bent under hardship, Daniel stood steady. But Sarah wondered, did he truly see her for who she was? Or would he wake one day and regret the choice he had made? The town admired him. They spoke of his herd, his land, his hard work. But they also whispered behind Sarah's back, asking why such a man would tie himself to a barren woman. She felt the sting of those words every time she walked through the market, every time she saw mothers holding their children close. One evening, as the sun sank low, Sarah stood at the window of her small room above the dressmaker's shop. The horizon burned with gold. The sky stretched wide with promise, yet her heart sank. Tomorrow was to be her wedding day. Tomorrow she would stand beside Daniel, promise her life to him, promise love she feared was not enough. Her fingers twisted at the fabric of her dress. She thought of what she had kept hidden, the truth that weighed on her tongue like a stone. He deserved to know. She could not keep silent any longer, not with vows before her. She imagined his face, the disappointment, the withdrawal. A man needed a legacy. What kind of life could she give him? But Daniel, when he came that evening, did not carry the doubts she carried. He stepped into the small parlor with a quiet ease, the smell of horses and dust following him in. His voice was calm as he asked how she was. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. She told him then, her voice breaking under the weight of fear, "Daniel, I cannot give you a son." The words fell heavy between them and the silence stretched. She lowered her gaze, bracing for the wound she was sure would come. All her fears, all the whispers pressed in on her like the walls of a closing room. Daniel did not speak at once. Instead, he stepped closer. She felt the warmth of his shadow fall across her. Slowly, he reached out, taking her trembling hands into his own calloused palms. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, carrying no trace of the judgment she feared. "Sarah," he said softly, "give me your heart. That is all I ask." Her breath caught. She lifted her eyes to his, searching, wondering if she had heard him right. In his face she saw no anger, no shame, only resolve. The room seemed to be still. Outside, the prairie winds shifted, carrying away the day's dust. Inside, Sarah felt something stir for the first time in years, a fragile, trembling hope. And yet, even with Daniel's words, the world outside still waited. Whispers would not be quiet. Doubts would not vanish. Tomorrow would still come. But tonight, in the quiet of that small room, Sarah's heart began to believe that maybe love, just love, could be enough. The wedding morning broke with a pale light spilling across the plains. Sarah rose early, though she had barely slept. Her hands trembled as she dressed, smoothing her simple gown again and again as if the fabric might cover her doubts. The church bell rang faintly in the distance, carried by the wind, reminding her that the hour had come. Outside, the town stirred. Wagons rolled down the dirt road, children laughed, and neighbors gathered, curious to witness the union. In small towns, nothing stayed hidden, and every moment became a story shared over hearth and supper. Sarah knew that eyes would watch her closely today, measuring her smile, her steps, her worth. The little church sat at the edge of town, wooden and plain, yet proud against the endless sky. Its doors stood open, welcoming all who entered. Inside, Daniel waited near the altar, his broad shoulders straight, his hat set aside. His calm presence filled the room, though he too felt the weight of those whispers. He knew what people thought of his choice, but he did not waver. As Sarah walked down the aisle, whispers stirred at the edges of the benches. Some guests smiled warmly, but others leaned close to their neighbors, murmuring words not meant for her ears. Still she felt them, sharp, piercing, like thorns in her skin. Yet Daniel's eyes met hers, steady and unshaken, pulling her forward with every step. When the vows were spoken, Sarah's voice quivered, but Daniel's rang clear, strong, and unwavering. He took her hand, not as a man burdened by sacrifice, but as one certain of his choice. "With all I am," he said, "I will keep you." The words settled over her like a sheltering roof, and though the crowd's murmurs did not vanish, she felt a quiet strength rise in her. The days that followed their wedding were not easy. Their small ranch demanded labor from sunup to sundown. Fences needed mending, cattle wandered too far, and storms rolled heavy across the plains. Sarah worked alongside Daniel, her hands blistering, her back aching, but she found purpose in the sweat. She cooked, she mended. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, each day a test of her resolve. Yet even in their work, shadows lingered. At the market, women spoke of newborns and sons, their arms cradling bundles she could never hold. Men tipped their hats to Daniel, but shook their heads when they thought no one saw. A strong man, they said, yet no heir to carry his name. Rumors grew louder when a rival rancher, Thomas Grady, began to speak against Daniel. Grady was a man of wealth with a broad herd and a proud mouth. He mocked Daniel openly, laughing at his barren wife. His words cut through the air like blades, cruel and sharp. Sarah heard them once while passing by the blacksmith shop. Grady's voice carried full of scorn. "A man like Daniel wastes his strength. What good is land if he leaves no son behind?" The men around him laughed, though some turned away with unease. Sarah's chest burned. Shame threatened to swallow her whole. Yet when she returned home, Daniel's calm gaze steadied her once more. He said nothing of the insult, only set his hat on the peg and drew her close. His silence was not weakness, it was strength, a choice not to answer cruelty with cruelty. Still inside, Sarah wrestled with guilt. She wondered if Daniel truly felt no regret. She feared one day he might believe the words spoken by others. Yet when she lay awake at night, listening to the wind press against the walls, she remembered his vow. "Give me your heart." It was not an easy promise to trust. But slowly, through the turning of days and the sweat of their labor, she began to believe he meant it. And still the world outside pressed harder, waiting for cracks to show. Summer came hard that year, burning the land with a heat that showed no mercy. The sky, wide and empty, gave no rain. Grass withered to dust and the cattle grew thin. Every step across the fields raised a cloud of powder that clung to clothes and lungs alike. Sarah wiped sweat from her brow as she carried water to the garden, but even the soil cracked and crumbled in her hands. Daniel worked from dawn to dark, driving the herd farther each day to find grass enough to keep them alive. His shirt was worn, his hands blistered, but his spirit never bent. Sarah watched him. Worry pressed deep into her heart, yet pride rose too. Whatever the world said, he was a man of strength and grit. The drought tested them both. Nights were restless, filled with the groans of thirsty cattle and the distant howl of coyotes. Food grew scarce, and every penny they earned had to stretch further than it could reach. Sarah sewed by lamplight, patching torn shirts and worn trousers, trying to keep something of their lives in order. But the drought did not only test their ranch, it sharpened the tongues of others. In town, whispers grew crueler. "This is what happens," some muttered, "when a man builds a house without sons to help him." Thomas Grady's laughter rang louder than all. He swaggered into the saloon and told anyone who would listen that Daniel's land would soon be his. "A man without heirs cannot hold against the world forever," he sneered. Sarah heard these things, though Daniel never spoke of them. He carried himself as though the noise did not matter, though she saw the tightness in his jaw when Grady's name was spoken. One evening, Sarah found him at the corral, leaning on the rail, watching the thin cattle move slowly in the dust. She stepped close, laying a hand on his arm. "They say things," she whispered, her voice low. "They say you'll regret me." Daniel turned to her, his eyes steady under the fading light. "Let them talk," he said. "Their words don't build my home, and they won't tear it down." Sarah tried to believe, but the guilt still gnawed. She lay awake that night, listening to the restless cattle outside, her mind heavy with doubt. She remembered the way Grady's words stung. Barren wife, wasted strength. The shame clung tighter than the heat of the summer air. Days stretched long, and the drought did not break. Then one morning Sarah stood at the well and found it nearly dry. Her hands trembled as she carried the last bucket inside. She felt the walls of worry closing in. But Daniel only took the bucket from her and said, "We'll manage. We always do." His steadiness calmed her, but it did not erase the ache in her chest. She wanted to be enough for him, wanted to give him more than a weary ranch and her tired hands. Yet every day he reminded her with quiet actions, fixing her chair when it broke, leaving a wildflower at her place at supper, that she was already what he had chosen. Still, the world outside pressed harder. Grady spread word that when Daniel's ranch failed, he would buy it cheap. Men laughed with him, though some shook their heads. For Sarah, the words became heavier than the drought itself. She wondered how much longer their love could stand against the tide of shame and hardship. But Daniel's vow echoed in her heart, steady as a heartbeat. "Give me your heart." And though the land cracked beneath their feet, she clung to that promise, hoping it would hold. The drought stretched on, but Sarah and Daniel held their ground. Each day felt heavier than the last, yet they worked side by side, carrying the weight together. The cattle grew weaker, the crops failed, and their savings thinned like the soil beneath their boots. Still, Daniel's steady hand on her shoulder, his calm nods gave Sarah reason to rise each morning. But the outside world would not rest. Thomas Grady saw weakness as an open door. He began circling closer, visiting town more often, speaking louder, boasting of how soon Daniel's ranch would belong to him. "A man with no sons cannot fight forever," he told anyone who would listen. His words spread like fire in dry grass. It was at the general store one afternoon when Sarah faced his cruelty directly. She stood in line with flour in her hands, the last of their coins clutched tight when Grady entered. His boots struck the floor with confidence, his wide hat shadowing eyes full of scorn. "Well, if it isn't Mrs. Daniels," he said, loud enough for all to hear, twisting her name with mockery. "How's the ranch holding? Or should I say, how much longer till it's mine?" The room chuckled, some nervously, others in agreement. Sarah felt the heat rise in her face, her throat tightening. She wanted to vanish, yet she stood still, pressing the flour to her chest. Grady leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough. "A man like Daniel deserves a legacy. Shame you couldn't give him one." The words cut like knives. Sarah paid quickly and left, her eyes burning, her steps unsteady. Outside, she leaned against the post, fighting tears. Daniel found her there later, her face pale, her hands shaking. She told him what happened, and for the first time she saw anger flash in his eyes. But Daniel did not storm to Grady. He did not fight with fists or threats. He simply said, "He feeds on weakness. Don't give it to him." His voice was quiet, but his jaw was set, his shoulders tight. Sarah knew he carried the insult deep, but he carried it like he carried everything. Inside, unshaken, until the time came to act. As weeks passed, Sarah's doubts grew heavier. She saw the way townsfolk looked at them, some with pity, others with scorn. She heard whispers about how the ranch wouldn't last, how Daniel had gambled his future on a barren wife. Each word pressed harder on her heart. At night, lying in the dark, she turned away so Daniel wouldn't see her tears. But Daniel always knew. He would reach across the bed, his hand rough from work yet gentle as it found hers. "You're enough," he would whisper. though she did not always believe it. One evening, after a long day of mending fences, Sarah found Daniel sitting on the porch, the fading sun painting his face in amber light. He was quiet, staring out across the land. She sat beside him, silence stretching between them. At last she spoke what weighed heaviest. "Daniel, maybe they're right. Maybe you'd be better without me." His head turned, his eyes fierce, his voice steady. "Don't you ever say that again. You are my home, Sarah. Without you, this land means nothing." The words struck deep. For a moment she let herself believe them, let herself breathe in the truth of his vow. Yet even as love anchored her, the storm of doubt outside their door grew. Grady was not finished. He was waiting, watching, ready to strike when they were weakest. Sarah did not yet know it, but soon she would stand beside Daniel in a fight far greater than words or whispers. A fight for their land, their life, and the love that held them together. The summer sky darkened one evening as clouds rolled in heavy, but they brought no rain, only wind and dust. Sarah stood at the porch watching the horizon blur. When she saw riders in the distance, her chest tightened. Daniel stepped out beside her, his hand brushing the brim of his hat, his eyes narrowing. He knew before she spoke. It was Grady. The riders drew closer, their horses kicking up dry earth. Grady led them, straight-backed in his saddle, his mouth twisted in a smile that never reached his eyes. Behind him rode 3 men, rough and armed, their faces hardened by greed. They pulled up at the fence, dust settling around them like a storm that refused to pass. "Evening, Daniels," Grady called, his voice loud and mocking. "Heard your herd's thinning. Heard your wells are near dry. Shame, isn't it? Land like this ought to belong to a man who can use it." Daniel stepped forward, calm, his boots steady on the ground. "This land belongs to me. It'll stay that way." Grady's grin widened. "A man without sons has no one to carry it on. You can't fight time, Daniel. Sell it to me now before the drought buries you." Sarah felt her heart pound, but Daniel did not move. His voice was low even. "I don't sell what I built with my hands." Grady leaned forward in the saddle, his eyes flicking to Sarah. "Shame your hands built it for nothing. What legacy will you leave, your barren wife and empty fields?" His men laughed, the sound sharp as knives. Sarah's face burned, but Daniel stood tall. "Leave," he said, his voice like stone. For a moment silence stretched. Then Grady chuckled, slow and dangerous. "Soon, Daniels. Sooner than you think." With a sharp pull on the reins, he turned his horse. His men followed, dust trailing behind them as they rode back into the distance. That night the air in the small house was heavy. Sarah tried to speak, but Daniel's face was unreadable as he mended a broken bridle at the table. At last she whispered, "He won't stop." Daniel set the leather down, looking at her with steady eyes. "Then neither will I." Days passed and Sarah felt the pressure grow. Grady's men prowled the edges of their land, watching, waiting. Neighbors spoke of trouble brewing, some warning Daniel to sell before things turned ugly. But Daniel's answer never changed. "This land is ours." Sarah's fears grew heavier. She dreamed of fire sweeping through the fields, of Grady's men taking everything. Each morning she rose with a tightness in her chest, yet she forced herself to work beside Daniel. She cooked, cleaned, hauled water, and mended fences. She wanted to prove she was strong enough, even if her heart wavered in the dark. One evening, as they brought in the last of the cattle, Daniel caught her hand. "You're tired," he said gently. "Rest," she shook her head. "If you fight, I fight." He studied her, his eyes softening. He did not argue. Instead, he squeezed her hand, a silent vow between them. The drought had weakened their land, but it had not weakened their bond. Grady believed Daniel was alone, but he was wrong. Sarah stood with him, not as a legacy, not as an heir-bearer, but as his partner, his heart. And soon that truth would be tested in fire and blood. When Grady made his move, the wind carried trouble the next week. Sarah felt it before it came, a heaviness in the air, a silence that pressed down on the ranch like a warning. Daniel sharpened his tools, mended the barn door, and checked the fences with more care than usual. He knew Grady's kind, men who smiled as they plotted, men who took what they wanted when they thought no one could stop them. One afternoon, Sarah was hanging laundry on the line when she saw smoke in the distance. Her heart jumped. It wasn't from a home but from the fields, their pasture. Dropping the basket, she ran, her skirt pulling against her legs, dust flying under her boots. Daniel was already there, beating back the flames with a wet sack, his body straining against the heat. The fire had started along the fence line, too sudden to be a chance. Sarah grabbed another sack and joined him, her arms swinging, the smoke choking her throat. They fought side by side, sweat and ash streaking their faces. At last the flames died, leaving blackened ground behind. Daniel stood breathing hard, staring at the charred earth. "Grady," he muttered, his jaw clenched. Sarah swallowed against the smoke still burning in her lungs. "He's trying to drive us out," Daniel nodded. His silence was heavy, not of surrender but of resolve. That night, as Sarah cleaned the ash from her hands, fear gnawed at her. What if Grady came again, stronger? What if he burned more than Fields? She looked at Daniel across the table, his face lit by the flicker of the lamp. His calm steadiness was like a wall against the storm, but she felt the tremor in her own heart. "Daniel," she whispered, "what if we lose everything?" He set down his cup, looking at her with those steady eyes. "Then we build again. What matters can't be burned." She blinked, tears stinging her eyes. "What matters?" "You," he said simply. "Us." The words warmed her, but the fear lingered. The next days brought no peace. Grady's men rode by more often, watching from a distance, their laughter carried by the wind. Sarah gripped her shawl tighter whenever she saw them, but she refused to hide. She walked beside Daniel, her chin lifted, her heart trembling yet unbroken. One evening, while Daniel checked the barn, Sarah lit the lanterns inside. She heard hooves outside and froze. Shadows moved near the fence, too many to be chance. She rushed to the door, calling for Daniel. He was already there, rifle in hand, his posture calm but ready. Grady rode up, his men fanning out behind him. His smile was sharp, cruel in the dim light. "Evening again," he said. "I see you're still holding on. Foolish Daniels. Give me the land and I'll spare you more trouble. Keep your wife safe at home. It's more than she deserves." Sarah's chest tightened. Fear battled anger in her veins. Daniel's voice cut through, calm but unyielding. "Leave my land." Grady's grin faded. "One day soon you'll wish you had taken my offer." With that he wheeled his horse, his men following, the sound of hooves fading into the night. Sarah stood in the doorway, her hands shaking. Daniel lowered his rifle but kept it close. She looked at him, searching his face. He gave her a small nod as if to say, "We will endure." But Sarah knew this was not the end. Grady would not stop with threats and smoke. A storm was coming, and she would have to find the strength to stand beside Daniel no matter the cost. The storm came sooner than Sarah expected. It was a moonless night. The ranch wrapped in darkness, the cattle restless in the corral. Sarah lay awake, her ears straining at every sound. Then she heard it. Hooves pounding the earth, shouts cutting through the still air. She shot up in bed. "Daniel!" He was already on his feet, pulling on his boots, rifle in hand. Sarah grabbed her shawl and lantern, her heart racing. Outside, shadows moved like wolves in the night. Grady's men. A crash split the silence. The barn door slammed open. The cattle bawled in panic, hooves thundering as men drove them out. Daniel ran forward, firing a warning shot into the sky. "Leave my land!" he shouted. The men answered with gunfire. Bullets cracked through the night, splinters flying from the corral fence. Sarah ducked behind the porch post, clutching the lantern tight. Fear surged, but something fiercer burned too. She could not hide while Daniel fought alone. She ran to the barn, her skirts catching on the dry ground. One of Grady's men reached for her, but she swung the lantern hard, the glass shattering, flames licking his sleeve. He cursed and stumbled back, the fire forcing him away. Daniel's voice rang through the chaos. "Sarah, get down!" But she did not stop. She grabbed a pitchfork leaning by the fence and thrust it toward another man climbing over. The force of her strike sent him falling back into the dust. The fight roared around them, shouts, gunshots, the frantic cries of cattle scattering into the fields. Grady himself rode forward, his face twisted with rage. "Daniels! This ends tonight!" he bellowed. Daniel fired, the bullet grazing Grady's hat. The rival pulled his horse sharply, fury flashing in his eyes. "You'll regret this," he snarled, pulling away into the dark. His men, shaken and scattered, followed after him, retreating into the night. The ranch grew quiet again except for the pounding of Sarah's heart and the fading thunder of hooves. Smoke rose from the barn, where hay had caught fire from a stray lantern. Without a word, Daniel and Sarah ran to douse the flames, working side by side, their hands blistered, their faces streaked with ash. At last, the fire died. They stood in the blackened barn, the smell of smoke thick in the air. Sarah's chest heaved, her arms trembling. Daniel stepped to her, taking the pitchfork from her hand, setting it aside. His rough palms framed her face, his eyes fierce yet gentle. "You shouldn't have been out there," he said. She swallowed hard. "I couldn't let you fight alone." For a long moment he held her gaze. Then he nodded, the faintest smile touching his lips. "You didn't." Tears pricked her eyes. Not from fear, but from something deeper. Pride. Love and the sudden knowledge that together, they had stood unbroken. The night had tested them, and though the ranch bore scars, they still stood on their land side by side. Sarah's heart beat steadily now, no longer weighed with shame. For the first time she felt the truth of Daniel's vow. Her heart was enough because it was her courage, her love that kept them whole. Yet she knew this was not the last trial. Grady had retreated, but he had not given up. Another storm would come, fiercer than this. Still, as she looked at Daniel in the glow of smoldering ash, she believed more firmly than ever. They would face it together. The days after the attack were tense. The cattle that hadn't scattered still bore the marks of fear. The barn smelled of smoke and the fence was splintered. Sarah and Daniel worked hard to set things right, their bodies aching, but their will unbroken. Neighbors passed by whispering about the raid, yet no one stepped forward to stand with them. Some pitied, others judged, but most were too afraid to take sides against Grady. At the market, Sarah felt the weight of their stares. Some women shook their heads, murmuring that Daniel was foolish for clinging to a barren wife and a dying ranch. Their words stung, but she held her chin high, walking back to her wagon with quiet dignity. She had faced fire and bullets. She would not bend for whispers. Daniel, too, remained steady, though Sarah saw the tension in his shoulders, the lines deepening on his face. He spoke little of what had happened, but at night she heard him pacing the floor, restless. She knew he was waiting, watching for Grady's next move, and it came. It was a Sunday evening when the church bell rang an alarm, its clang echoing across the plains. Daniel and Sarah were just finishing supper when the sound reached them. He rose at once, grabbing his rifle. Sarah followed, her breath quick, her hands cold. From the porch, they saw it, flames rising in the distance, not from their ranch this time, but from the neighbors. The fire glowed against the night sky, spreading fast through the dry fields. Shadows of riders circled the blaze, their shouts carried by the wind. Grady's men. Daniel's jaw tightened. "He's burning out the neighbors to get to us." Without hesitation, they saddled their horses and rode toward the fire. The heat met them before they reached the ridge, the smoke thick, choking the air. Neighbors tried in vain to beat back the flames, but Grady's men drove them off, laughing as the fire devoured the land. Daniel rode forward, rifle raised, his voice strong. "Grady, this ends tonight." Through the smoke, Grady appeared on horseback, his face lit by firelight, twisted with triumph. "You should have sold when you had the chance," he roared. "Now everything you touch will burn." Gunfire cracked, men shouted, horses reared. Sarah's heart pounded as she clung to the reins, but she would not turn back. She saw one of Grady's men aiming at Daniel. Without thinking, she urged her horse forward, slamming into him before the shot could fire true. The man toppled into the dirt, his gun skittering away. Daniel fired back, his bullet striking the ground near Grady's horse, forcing him to pull away. Chaos spread through the smoke, the blaze roaring, the men scattering. Sarah leapt down, grabbing a bucket from the line of neighbors and throwing water onto the flames. Others followed her lead, and slowly, piece by piece, the fire began to die. At last, the worst of the blaze was beaten down. The fields were scarred, the air thick with smoke, but the home still stood. Grady and his men had fled into the night, their laughter gone, replaced by silence. Daniel found Sarah, her dress singed, her hands black with soot. He took her shoulders, his voice rough with relief. "You could have been killed." She met his eyes, her voice steady despite her trembling. "So could you." For a moment neither spoke. Then Daniel pulled her close, holding her tight against his chest as if to shield her from the world itself. Around them the neighbors gathered, their faces weary but changed. They had seen Sarah fight beside her husband, unflinching in the face of fire and fear, and for the first time the whispers of pity began to fall silent. Yet Sarah knew Grady was not done. He had lost this battle, but his hatred still burned, and when he returned it would be for Daniel's land, for their very life together. The days after the fire were uneasy. The town buzzed with talk of Grady's cruelty, yet no one dared to name him openly. Neighbors avoided Daniel in the street, afraid of being tied to his fight. Sarah felt the tension pressing heavier than the summer heat. Grady had been beaten back twice, but she knew he would not stop. Daniel prepared quietly. He repaired the fences, checked the rifle, and set extra water barrels by the barn. His movements were calm, steady, but Sarah could see the fire in his eyes. He was ready for the storm he knew was coming. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Sarah stood beside him at the porch. The silence stretched long until she whispered, "Do you ever wish you had chosen differently? A wife who could give you sons to help fight this?" Daniel turned to her, his gaze unshaken. "I don't measure life in sons or legacies. I measure it in love, and I would choose you again every time." Her throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes. She had doubted herself so long, but in that moment, his words rooted deeper than all the shame she had carried. Night fell heavy, and with it came the sound they had been waiting for, hooves thundering, many this time. Sarah's heart pounded. She looked at Daniel, and he gave a single nod. Together they moved into the yard side by side, ready. Grady rode in with more men than before, their torches blazing against the dark. He pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the corral, his face hard, his voice cutting through the night. "This is the end, Daniels. You can't fight me forever. Tonight your land is mine." Daniel raised his rifle, his voice even. "You'll never take what isn't yours." Grady sneered, lifting his hand. His men surged forward, shouting, their torches swinging. Gunfire split the night. Sarah dropped to her knees behind the trough, her hands gripping a bucket of water, ready to douse the fire if it spread. Bullets struck wood, sparks flying as the men pressed closer. Daniel fired with sharp precision, forcing them back. Sarah's breath came fast, her body trembling, but she would not hide. When one of the men broke off toward the barn, torch high, she grabbed the shotgun Daniel had left near the porch. Her arms shook as she lifted it, but she pulled the trigger. The blast roared. The man dropped his torch, and the barn was spared. Her ears rang, her body unsteady, but Daniel's shout cut through. "Good girl!" His pride gave her the strength to rise again. Grady urged his horse forward, rage boiling on his face. A barren wife in a dying ranch.
"I'll see it all to ash,"
he bellowed, but Daniel stood firm, rifle leveled. "This land is ours. Our life is ours. You'll never break us." The fight stretched fierce, but the couple held their ground, their courage burning brighter than the torches. Neighbors, drawn by the gunfire, began to gather at the ridge. They watched as Sarah and Daniel stood back to back, driving off the attackers, their unity unshaken. At last, Grady's men faltered, pulling back under Daniel's steady fire. The torches fell, the shouts faded until only Grady remained, his horse stamping restless beneath him. He glared at Daniel, hatred twisting his face. "This isn't over," he spat. Daniel's voice was calm as stone. Yes, it is, leave. For a long moment, Grady's fury burned in the silence. Then, with a sharp jerk of the reins, he wheeled his horse and fled into the night. His men followed, vanishing into the dark. The yard grew quiet. Smoke drifting, the stars shining faintly above. Sarah's body trembled, her hands raw, but she felt a strange strength in her chest. They had stood against him and won. Morning came soft and golden after the long night of battle. The ranch bore its scars, the fence broken in places, the barn wall blackened with soot, but it still stood. The cattle had not been taken. The land was safe. Sarah stepped outside with the dawn, her body aching from exhaustion. She breathed in the cool air, heavy with the smell of smoke and earth. Daniel was already in the yard, hammer in hand, mending what had been broken. His shoulders were steady, his movements sure. From the ridge came the sound of wagon wheels. The townsfolk arrived slowly, cautious at first. They had heard the gunfire, seen the flames, and now curiosity pulled them closer. For months they had whispered about Sarah, pitying or mocking her for what she could not give. But this morning, their eyes held something different. Old Mrs. Cooper was the first to speak. She looked at Sarah with trembling lips. "Child, you fought like a lioness." A murmur of agreement rose. Men who once mocked Daniel for choosing a barren wife now tipped their hats in respect. Women who once whispered behind Sarah's back now reached for her hands, their eyes softened with awe. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, unsure how to answer. She had not fought for their approval. She had fought for Daniel, for their home. Yet in their faces she saw something new. Honor. Daniel joined her, setting aside his hammer. His arm slipped around her shoulders, strong and steady. He looked at the gathered crowd and said simply, "This land stands because of her. She is my strength." The words broke something open in Sarah's chest. For so long she had feared she was not enough. But now, under the morning sun, she felt the truth in every beat of her heart. She was not defined by what she could not give, but by the life she did give. The courage, the love, the unyielding devotion that kept their home alive. The townsfolk lingered, offering help to mend the damage. Hands that once judged now carried timber and nails. In time, the fence was rebuilt, the barn patched, and laughter even returned to the yard. As days passed, Sarah noticed how the stares changed in town. No longer pity, no longer mockery, only respect. She and Daniel were no longer measured by legacy, but by the life they built together. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of embers, Sarah and Daniel saddled their horses. The land stretched wide before them, wild and untamed, yet filled with promise. Sarah reached for Daniel's hand, their fingers lacing together. She whispered, "I thought I had to give you more." Daniel turned, his eyes warm and steady. "You gave me everything. You gave me your heart. That's all I ever needed." Her chest swelled with quiet joy. At last she believed it. Not as fragile comfort, but as truth carved deep into the life they shared. Together they rode into the open horizon, the wind carrying their laughter. The future would bring storms, hardships, and trials yet unseen, but none of it frightened Sarah anymore. She had Daniel, and Daniel had her. Legacy was not written in children or land. Legacy was written in love, and theirs was a love strong enough to outlast the whispers of any town, strong enough to stand against fire and fear. A love that needed no heir, no proof, only two hearts bound together forever. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, wild and free. And with Daniel's hand in hers, Sarah knew they were already home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Shadow Frontier Tales for more Wild West stories of love, struggle, and hope. And share it with someone who believes that love is stronger than legacy.